The date was June 28, 1914. A sunny morning in Sarajevo, where Archduke Franz Ferdinand adjusted his military uniform, completely unaware that within hours his blood would stain cobblestones and ignite a war that would consume empires. What I'm about to tell you sounds impossible. One gunshot, 4 empires dead, 9 million soldiers never coming home. A single bullet fired by a 19-year-old would trigger the collapse of dynasties that had ruled for centuries, redraw the map of Europe in blood, and birth the modern world from the ashes of the old. This isn't just another history lesson about dates and battles. This is the story of how civilization nearly destroyed itself, how poison gas turned battlefields into scenes from hell, how machine guns mowed down entire generations in single afternoons, how submarines transformed passenger ships into underwater coffins. You'll witness the Christmas truce of 1914 when enemies played football in no man's land. The horror of Verdun, where 700,000 men became casualties for a few miles of mud. The moment America entered a European war for the first time. And Germany's final desperate gamble that nearly won everything before losing it all. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. Europe in 1914 was more connected, more civilized, more advanced than ever before. Electric lights blazed along the Champs-Élysées. Millionaires sailed first class on floating palaces across the Atlantic. The global economy hummed with unprecedented prosperity. Yet beneath this golden surface, the great powers had spent 25 years building the most sophisticated suicide machine in human history. And they called it peace. Norman Angel's bestseller, The Great Illusion, sat on nightstands across Europe, preaching that modern war was economically impossible, too expensive, too interconnected, too civilized. Angel would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for this beautiful, catastrophic delusion. Meanwhile, Europe's leaders were playing diplomatic Russian roulette. It started innocently enough. 2 empires, Germany and Austria-Hungary, signing a mutual defense pact in 1879. Then Italy joined, forming the Triple Alliance. France, still bleeding from its humiliation in the Franco-Prussian War, seduced Russia into an alliance in 1894. Britain abandoned its splendid isolation and cozied up to France, then Russia. By 1914, Europe had divided itself into 2 armed camps, each promising to die for the other. A diplomat later called this alliance web a suicide pact. The metaphor proved grimly accurate. At the center of this powder keg sat 3 cousins who would drag the world into hell. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Queen Victoria's grandson, was a walking contradiction. Born with a withered left arm, Wilhelm learned to hide his disability beneath carefully tailored uniforms. His greatest obsession was beating his British cousins at their own game. He launched a naval arms race that consumed 1/5 of Germany's budget, building a high seas fleet designed for one purpose: challenging the Royal Navy. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II was drowning in his own weakness. This gentle, loving father never wanted to be emperor. He'd rather have been a country gentleman, playing with his children and collecting stamps. But history had other plans. Nicholas's empire was a powder keg wrapped in gold leaf. Industrial workers lived in overcrowded, disease-ridden slums. Millions of peasants still worked fields they could never own. His military had been humiliated by Japan. White Europeans beaten by an Asian power for the first time in centuries. And then there was the Rasputin problem. The Mad Monk had insinuated himself into the royal family through his ability to stop the bleeding episodes of Nicholas's hemophiliac son. The Russian people believed he was the devil himself, corrupting their monarchy. But here's what terrified German generals. Russia was getting stronger every day. The Trans-Siberian Railway was nearly complete. Russian industry had surged dramatically. Military reforms were transforming the army. German staff assessments suggested they had maybe 5 years before Russia became unbeatable. The clock was ticking. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph ruled an empire held together by habit and Habsburg bureaucracy. He'd survived 66 years on the throne by outlasting everyone who opposed him. But fate had been cruel. His son Rudolf had blown his brains out in a suicide pact. His wife Elizabeth had been stabbed through the heart by an anarchist. His brother had faced a Mexican firing squad. Austria-Hungary wasn't a country. It was a controlled explosion of competing nationalisms. Czechs plotted independence in Prague coffeehouses. Southern Slavs looked across the border to Serbia with hungry eyes. The empire existed because nobody could agree on how to carve up what many saw as a dying realm. The arms race had become pure madness. Between 1908 and 1913, European military spending exploded by roughly 50%. Germany expanded its army from 600,000 to 800,000 men. France's 1913 three-year service law forced every young man to serve longer. Russia's Great Program planned to field massive armies that would dwarf anything Europe had seen. The naval race was even more insane. Britain's HMS Dreadnought had made every existing battleship obsolete overnight, triggering a frantic scramble to build bigger, deadlier floating fortresses. Each new dreadnought cost millions of pounds, vast sums for ships that would rarely leave harbor. Most would spend the war safely anchored, too valuable to risk in actual combat. But the most dangerous delusion of all. Every general, every admiral, every politician believed the next war would be short. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Modern firepower was too devastating for anything longer. Industrial economies couldn't survive the disruption. Everyone would be home by Christmas with victory parades and medals. In early summer 1914, tourists packed luxury hotels in Baden-Baden and Monte Carlo. Artists debated cubism in Parisian cafes. The future glittered with promise. None could imagine that within months, poison gas would turn battlefields into scenes from hell. That machine guns would murder entire battalions in single afternoons. That submarines would turn passenger ships into coffins beneath the waves. The golden age was about to end with a gunshot in Sarajevo, and the world would never be innocent again. Here's the twisted irony that makes the tragedy even more bitter. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was probably Austria-Hungary's best hope for peace. Unlike the old emperor and the warhawks in Vienna, the Archduke favored reform over repression. He wanted to grant Slavs more autonomy within the empire, exactly what the assassins claimed to want. His death would eliminate the one man who might have prevented the war they were about to unleash. But on that sunny morning in Sarajevo, none of this mattered. What mattered was that a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip was sitting near Moritz Schiller's delicatessen, staring at his unfinished sandwich. The teenage tuberculosis patient should have been celebrating or fleeing. Instead, he was contemplating failure. The assassination plot had been perfect on paper. The Black Hand, Serbia's secret terrorist organization, had spent months planning the death of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. 6 assassins positioned along the motorcade route, bombs and pistols distributed. The target, a man whose death would supposedly liberate Bosnia's Slavs from Habsburg rule. But the morning had been a disaster. The first assassin had lost his nerve and melted into the crowd. The second had hurled his bomb at the Archduke's car, but the explosive had struck the folded roof and bounced into the street, detonating under the following vehicle. Several people were wounded, but Franz Ferdinand was unharmed. Remarkably, the Archduke insisted the planned visit continue. His wife Sophie begged him to leave, but Franz Ferdinand was stubborn and perhaps braver than anyone realized. "The fellow must be insane," he muttered about the bomber, brushing glass fragments from his uniform. After the bomb attack, the motorcade route was hastily changed. Instead of continuing down the planned path where the remaining assassins waited, the cars would take a different street to visit the wounded officer in the hospital. Princip and the other conspirators abandoned their positions, assuming the mission had failed. This is where fate intervened with cruel precision. The Archduke's driver hadn't been informed of the route change. As the motorcade approached Franz Joseph Street, the provincial governor sitting beside him suddenly realized the mistake. "Are going the wrong way." "The stop," he shouted. Wee driver slammed on the brakes. The car stalled as he struggled to restart the engine and reverse direction. The vehicle came to a complete stop directly in front of Moritz Schiller's delicatessen. Gavrilo Princip looked up from his position and couldn't believe his eyes. The man he'd been sent to kill was sitting motionless, barely 5 feet away. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie sat in the open convertible like targets in a shooting gallery. Princip stood up, stepped forward, and drew his Belgian pistol. The first shot struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second hit Sophie in the abdomen. Both bullets were fired from point-blank range. So full. So full. The Archduke gasped as blood poured from his mouth. "Don't die. Stay alive for our children." Those were among his last coherent words. The Duchess was already dead, slumped over her husband's lap. Within minutes, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire had joined her. This sickly teenager had just murdered the future emperor and his wife, parents of 3 young children. He had lit the fuse that would detonate the modern world. What followed was 28 days of diplomatic madness that would make World War I not just possible, but inevitable. Austria-Hungary's response to the assassination revealed just how desperately the empire wanted war. Within hours of Franz Ferdinand's death, General Konrad von Hötzendorf was practically salivating at the opportunity he'd been craving. This was the same man who had advocated attacking Serbia 25 times in the previous 2 years. Now he finally had his justification. But here's where the story gets truly insane. Instead of moving quickly while emotions ran high, Austria-Hungary decided to consult with Germany first. They needed to know their ally would back them if Russia intervened to protect Serbia. What they received was the infamous blank check, Germany's promise of complete support for whatever action Vienna deemed necessary. Kaiser Wilhelm was aboard his yacht in the Baltic when the telegram arrived. His generals had been telling him for years that Germany faced an impossible strategic puzzle. How do you fight Russia and France simultaneously when either one alone could destroy you? The answer was simple and terrifying. You don't fight them simultaneously. You fight them sequentially. This was the Schlieffen Plan, 9 years in the making. Count Alfred von Schlieffen had obsessed over Germany's nightmare scenario and crafted what looked like military genius. His math was cold and precise. Russia needed 6 weeks to mobilize its massive army. France could be crushed in 5. Margin for error? 7 days. It was like performing brain surgery with a stopwatch. The plan required violating Belgian neutrality, guaranteed by Britain since 1839. German leaders knew this risked British intervention, but they calculated that France would fall before Britain could respond effectively. It was a catastrophic miscalculation that would cost Germany everything. On July 23rd, Austria delivered an ultimatum to Serbia so harsh it was designed to be rejected. 10 demands that would effectively turn Serbia into an Austrian puppet state. Serbia's response was remarkable. They accepted 8 of the 10 demands, rejecting only those that would allow Austrian police to operate on Serbian soil. For any rational government, this would have been enough to save face and avoid war. But Austria-Hungary wasn't interested in rational solutions. They wanted war, and Serbia's partial acceptance wasn't going to stop them. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The dominoes began falling with mechanical precision. Russian mobilization followed, not because the Tsar wanted war, but because abandoning Serbia would shatter Russian credibility as protector of the Slavs. German mobilization followed that, triggering the Schlieffen Plan's inflexible timetable. France honored its alliance with Russia. Germany invaded Belgium. Britain honored its guarantee of Belgian neutrality. Each step seemed logical, even inevitable, to the leaders taking it. None intended to start a world war. Each believed they were responding defensively to the aggression of others. Yet collectively, they were sleepwalking into catastrophe. The irony was that the two men who could have stopped it all were cousins who genuinely liked each other. Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas exchanged frantic telegrams in the final days, even as mobilization timetables took control away from both emperors. Willie and Nicky, as they called each other, watched helplessly as their war machines lurched into motion. But the most tragic figure was Kaiser Wilhelm himself. This grandson of Queen Victoria had never really wanted war with Britain. His naval building program wasn't preparation for conflict. It was a desperate attempt to win respect from his British relatives. He wanted to be accepted as an equal, not destroyed as an enemy. When Britain declared war, Wilhelm reportedly broke down and wept. By August 4th, German jackboots were crossing into Belgium, and what happened next shocked even the Germans. Belgium, a country smaller than West Virginia, told the German Empire to go to hell. King Albert, all of 5'6", stood up to the Kaiser's million-man army. Belgium is a nation, not a road, his government declared. The fortress city of Liège was supposed to fall in 2 days. Instead, 30,000 Belgian soldiers held off 120,000 Germans for nearly 2 weeks. Those crucial days gave Britain time to land troops, France time to reposition forces, and Russia time to mobilize faster than German planners had calculated. But the real catastrophe for Germany wasn't military. It was moral. German soldiers, trained for quick victory, found themselves fighting house to house against Belgian civilians. Panic set in. Reports flew of Frank's Terror, civilian snipers supposedly shooting from windows and church towers. Most were imaginary, but terrified German troops began seeing enemies everywhere. The massacres that followed were methodical and horrifying. In Dinant, German soldiers lined up 674 civilians against a wall and shot them execution style. Among the dead were infants barely weeks old. In Louvain, they burned the medieval university library. 300,000 books and manuscripts, some dating back 1,000 years, reduced to ash in a single night. German High Command had approved harsh policies of frightfulness to terrorize civilian populations into submission. What they didn't anticipate was the global reaction. British propaganda turned Belgian atrocities into recruitment gold. Posters showing German soldiers bayoneting babies were crude exaggerations, but close enough to reality to be believed. The violation of Belgian neutrality had handed the Allies the moral high ground on a silver platter. Germany had won battles, but lost the propaganda war before it had properly begun. Meanwhile, France was committing suicide by stupidity. Plan 17 was French military thinking at its most catastrophically romantic. General Ferdinand Foch actually taught that superior will could overcome modern firepower. In the next war, he'd lectured, victory will belong to the side which attacks. French soldiers marched to war in bright red trousers and blue coats that could be seen from miles away. When military officials suggested camouflage, War Minister Adolphe Messimy exploded. Eliminate the red trousers. Never. Red trousers are France. French fashion was about to meet German machine guns. The Battle of the Frontiers lasted 5 days. In those 5 days, France lost approximately 300,000 men, more casualties than America would suffer in many of its major conflicts combined. Entire regiments were wiped out in minutes as they charged across open fields toward entrenched German positions. Plan 17 died choking on its own blood. But the most shocking moment came when Britain honored its guarantee of Belgian neutrality. The British Expeditionary Force was the best army in the world. 120,000 professional soldiers who could shoot 15 rounds per minute with deadly accuracy. Kaiser Wilhelm had sneered at Britain's contemptible little army. Those words would become the BEF's badge of honor. At Mons, on August 23rd, reality met theory head-on. British rifle fire was so rapid and accurate that German troops reported facing massed machine guns. They weren't entirely wrong. A British soldier could fire faster than some machine guns, but there were only 2 British divisions against 4 German corps. Math eventually won. The retreat from Mons became legendary. For 14 days, British soldiers fought rearguard actions under blazing August heat. Men collapsed from exhaustion, their feet bleeding through worn-out boots. Some would later claim supernatural intervention, the famous Angels of Mons. Though these visions likely reflected exhaustion and trauma, they kept fighting, kept retreating, kept bleeding the German advance. By early September, German forces had advanced to within 30 miles of Paris. Panic gripped the capital. The government fled to Bordeaux like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Rich Parisians loaded carriages with jewelry and fled south. Poor Parisians prepared to fight in the streets. Then came the miracle that saved France. General Joseph Joffre, a man so calm under pressure that he never missed his afternoon nap even during the crisis, had been secretly assembling a new army east of Paris. British reconnaissance aircraft spotted something incredible. A 30-mile gap had opened between the German 1st and 2nd armies. It was like finding a crack in a seemingly impenetrable wall. On September 6th, Joffre launched the counterattack that would echo through history. "The hour has come," he telegraphed his commanders, "to advance at all costs and to die where you stand rather than give way." The most famous moment, 600 Paris taxis rushing troops to the front, was actually a tiny part of the battle, carrying about 6,000 men out of hundreds of thousands engaged. But the image was perfect. Civilization itself, grabbing whatever weapons it could find to fight the German war machine. For 3 days, the fate of France hung by a thread. Over 500,000 men clashed along a front stretching from Verdun to the outskirts of Paris. Then, German General Karl von Bülow blinked first. Fearing his Second Army was about to be surrounded, he ordered a retreat. Moltke, 70 miles away and completely out of touch, panicked and ordered a general withdrawal. The Schlieffen Plan, 9 years in the making, died in a moment of terror. Paris was saved, but at a staggering cost. Over 500,000 Franco-British casualties, 300,000 German. In 6 weeks of fighting, Europe had bled more than most wars produced in years. As autumn rain began to fall, exhausted armies dug trenches along the River Aisne. What started as temporary shelter became a 400-mile scar across Europe. The war of movement was over. The war of industrial slaughter was about to begin. Germany's brilliant gamble had failed by exactly the margin Schlieffen had calculated: 8 days. Instead of victory in 6 weeks, they faced the nightmare of a 2-front war stretching into an unknown future. The old world was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. What happened next defied every prediction made by Europe's military experts. Those temporary trenches along the Aisne River weren't temporary at all. They spread like a virus, growing deeper, more elaborate, more deadly with each passing day. By November 1914, 2 parallel systems of fortifications stretched from the Swiss border to the English Channel, 475 miles of human misery carved into the earth. This wasn't just digging holes in the ground. These trenches evolved into underground cities, complete with concrete bunkers, communication networks, and elaborate defensive systems. The front-line trench was just the beginning. Behind it lay support trenches, reserve trenches, command posts, ammunition dumps, and field hospitals, all connected by a maze of communication trenches that allowed movement without exposure to enemy fire. Between the opposing lines lay no man's land, a wasteland of barbed wire, shell craters, and the unburied dead. Some sections were barely 50 yards wide, others stretched for half a mile. All of it was swept by machine gun fire that made daytime movement suicidal. The machine gun had become the supreme arbiter of this new battlefield. The Maxim gun could fire 500 rounds per minute without pause. One gun could do the work of 50 riflemen. Two guns positioned correctly could stop an entire battalion. These weapons had transformed warfare into something unprecedented. A conflict where courage became irrelevant and mathematics governed survival. Attacking soldiers, no matter how brave or well-trained, moved at 3 miles per hour across open ground. Machine gun bullets traveled at 2,000 feet per second. The equation was simple and deadly. Human waves became the standard answer to mechanical firepower, turning battles into exercises in mass suicide. But if conventional weapons had made war more deadly, science was about to make it diabolic. German chemists, led by Fritz Haber, were developing something far more sinister than conventional explosives. Chlorine gas was abundant, cheap, and lethally effective. Heavier than air, it would sink into trenches where soldiers took shelter, attacking the respiratory system and drowning victims in their own fluids. The irony was tragic. Haber genuinely believed he was shortening the war by making it too horrible to continue. His wife, Clara, herself a chemist, would later take her own life with her husband's service pistol. Whether from despair over his chemical warfare, research remains debated, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Science itself was committing suicide. Meanwhile, beneath the waves, a new form of warfare was emerging that would blur the line between soldier and civilian forever. The submarine represented a revolution as profound as the machine gun had been on land. These steel sharks could attack without warning, strike from invisible positions, and disappear before their victims could respond. On September 5, 1914, HMS Pathfinder became the first warship in history sunk by a submarine-launched torpedo. 3 weeks later, U-9 achieved something even more shocking. In the space of 1 hour, a single German submarine sank 3 British cruisers. 1,400 British sailors died that morning, victims of a weapon most naval officers still considered unsporting. The implications were staggering. Britain depended on imported food to feed its population. Germany was beginning to realize that submarines could starve Britain into submission by sinking merchant ships carrying grain from America. For centuries, naval warfare had followed established rules. Warships fought warships. Merchant vessels were searched before being seized. Civilian passengers were allowed to escape. Submarines made such gentlemanly conduct nearly impossible. A U-boat that surfaced to inspect cargo became vulnerable to ramming or gunfire. This meant merchant vessels carrying food and supplies would increasingly become targets, and the distinction between combatant and civilian was about to face new challenges at sea. By winter 1914, the character of the Great War was becoming terrifyingly clear. Machine guns dominated the battlefield. Chemical weapons were being developed in secret laboratories. Submarines prowled the seas, ready to sink anything that moved. Science and industry were being harnessed for destruction on a scale never before imagined. Millions of men sat in trenches stretching from Switzerland to the sea, separated by a few hundred yards of wire and corpses. Behind them, the industrial might of Europe worked day and night to produce ever more efficient methods of killing. Factories that had made farm equipment now manufactured artillery shells. Chemical plants that had produced fertilizer were being converted to make poison gas. Shipyards that had built luxury liners now launched submarines. The old rules of war, honor, chivalry, the protection of non-combatants, were dying along with everything else. This was becoming something new in human history: industrialized slaughter conducted by entire nations. And this was only the beginning. Then something miraculous happened that would become one of the most extraordinary moments in military history. It began on Christmas Eve, 1914, with singing. German soldiers in trenches near Ypres began caroling Stille Nacht, Silent Night. British troops shivering in waterlogged trenches just yards away heard the familiar melody and began singing along in English. French soldiers added their voices with Douce Nuit. For a brief moment, no man's land echoed with harmony instead of gunfire. What happened next defied every military regulation in every army manual. Soldiers began climbing out of their trenches. First one, then dozens, then hundreds. Men who had been trying to kill each other hours earlier met in the middle of no man's land to shake hands and exchange Christmas greetings. The Christmas truce wasn't universal. It happened sporadically along the line, often against direct orders from officers. In some sectors, soldiers exchanged cigarettes and chocolate. In others, they showed each other photographs of wives and children back home. Near Fleur Bay, British and German soldiers actually played football using empty bully beef cans as goalposts. Private Alfred Dugan Chater of the Gordon Highlanders wrote to his mother, "I can hardly believe that I have been in the trenches for 5 days and have never fired a shot. The Germans are really quite decent fellows." German soldier Gustav Riebensam wrote in his diary, "How marvelously wonderful, yet how strange it was." The English officers felt the same way about it. The truce couldn't last. By December 26th, artillery shells were falling again. Officers on both sides, horrified by the fraternization, issued strict orders that any repetition would be treated as treason. The Christmas truce of 1914 became humanity's last gasp before the abyss. While the Western Front congealed into static horror, the Eastern Front exploded into catastrophic movement. Russia had mobilized faster than anyone expected, sending 2 massive armies into East Prussia. Their mission? Draw German troops away from the attack on France and strike at the heart of Prussia itself. The Russian steamroller looked unstoppable. Nearly 500,000 men advanced on 2 fronts, supported by cavalry and artillery. German defenders numbered barely 200,000. Panic gripped Berlin as Russian Cossacks raided deep into German territory. Kaiser Wilhelm demanded reinforcements be sent from France immediately. Instead, 2 officers were given command of the 8th Army: General Paul von Hindenburg and his chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff. Hindenburg was 67 years old, recalled from comfortable retirement to face the Russian menace. Tall, imposing, with a granite face and steely blue eyes, he looked like a Prussian general from central casting. Ludendorff was everything traditional Prussian officers weren't: brilliant, ruthless, risen through merit rather than birth. The son of a minor merchant, he had clawed his way up through sheer ability. Where Hindenburg provided calm leadership, Ludendorff provided the razor-sharp intellect that would destroy armies. Their first test came at Tannenberg in late August. Russian communications were so poor that commanders sent wireless messages in clear text, no codes, no encryption. German intelligence officers couldn't believe their luck as they intercepted detailed Russian battle plans, troop movements, and timetables. It was like playing poker with your opponent's cards face up. Ludendorff devised a plan of breathtaking audacity. Using East Prussia's excellent railway network, he would concentrate the entire German 8th Army against one Russian army while holding off the other with minimal forces. If it worked, they could destroy one Russian army before the other could intervene. If it failed, Russian armies would converge from 2 directions and annihilate them. The Battle of Tannenberg lasted 4 days. When it ended, an entire Russian army had ceased to exist. 92,000 prisoners marched into German captivity. 50,000 more lay dead in the forests of East Prussia. General Samsonov, overwhelmed by the catastrophe, wandered into the woods and shot himself. A week later, at the Masurian Lakes, Hindenburg and Ludendorff repeated their performance. Another 60,000 to 100,000 Russians were killed, wounded, or captured. In 2 weeks, Russia had lost more men than Germany had fielded in the entire East Prussian campaign. The victories made Hindenburg and Ludendorff national heroes overnight. Germans desperate for good news after the failure of the Schlieffen Plan elevated them to mythic status. Wooden statues of Hindenburg appeared in town squares where citizens could drive nails into them for war bonds. The bigger the donation, the bigger the nail. But the Eastern Front victories came with a hidden cost. Success bred ambition. Hindenburg and Ludendorff began demanding more troops, more resources, more authority. They started viewing themselves as Germany's indispensable men. By 1916, they would effectively control German strategy, while the Chancellor retained formal title but lost real power. As 1914 ended, the war had already exceeded every prediction. The Western Front was frozen in trenches that would barely move for 4 years. The Eastern Front had swallowed armies whole. Millions were already dead or wounded. But this was just the beginning. The machine gun was the supreme arbiter of this new battlefield, but generals on both sides had trained for the previous war, not this one. They believed in the power of human courage to overcome mechanical death. French doctrine still preached the mystical power of the offensive spirit. British officers had studied colonial wars, where brave men with rifles had charged native positions and won. German tacticians trusted in discipline and superior training. None had reckoned with the simple mathematics of modern firepower. Battles that in previous wars might have cost hundreds of casualties now consumed thousands in a single afternoon. The mathematics were becoming clear. Modern weapons had made frontal assault a form of mass suicide, yet somehow military commanders convinced themselves that the solution was more men, not different tactics. If 1,000 men couldn't break through, then send 2,000. If 2,000 failed, send 5,000. Human waves became the standard answer to mechanical firepower, and the result was slaughter on an unprecedented scale. By winter 1914, the strategic situation had crystallized into a pattern that would define the next 4 years. 2 massive armies faced each other across a narrow strip of devastated ground, each possessing enough firepower to destroy the other, but neither able to achieve decisive victory. The old world of cavalry charges and gentlemanly warfare was dead. What remained was something humanity had never seen before: total industrial war. The earth had opened up to swallow a generation, and it was still hungry. But the earth's appetite for destruction was about to grow even more ravenous. As 1915 dawned, military leaders on both sides convinced themselves they had learned the lessons of 1914. They were catastrophically wrong. What they had actually learned was how to kill more efficiently, not how to win decisively. The year would begin with one of the most spectacular military disasters in British history. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, stared at his maps and convinced himself he'd found the master key to ending the war. One brilliant stroke that would unlock the deadlock and crown him the savior of the British Empire. Instead, he was about to orchestrate a catastrophe that would nearly destroy his career and cost 250,000 Allied lives. Churchill's plan was breathtakingly simple in its arrogance. Smash through the Dardanelles with battleships, steam into Constantinople, and watch the Ottoman Empire collapse like a house of cards. The Royal Navy would accomplish what millions of soldiers couldn't. It was exactly the kind of bold thinking that had made Churchill's reputation. It was also exactly the kind that would nearly end it. Here's what nobody in London properly understood. The Turks weren't the sick man of Europe anymore. Under German guidance, they had transformed their defenses into something formidable, and they had a secret weapon Churchill never suspected. Mines laid by the Ottoman mine layer Nusret just days before the attack, March 18, 1915. The greatest naval armada since Trafalgar steamed toward the Dardanelles. 16 battleships led by HMS Queen Elizabeth, the most powerful warship on Earth. Their mission: blast through Turkish defenses through sheer firepower. For hours, it looked like Churchill's strategy was working. Turkish batteries fell silent under torrents of 15-inch shells. Then the Turks played their hidden card. The French battleship Bouvet struck a mine and vanished in 2 minutes with 640 souls. HMS Irresistible followed. Then HMS Ocean. In one afternoon, the Allied fleet suffered unprecedented losses to an enemy they had completely underestimated. Churchill's naval assault was dead. But political momentum wouldn't let him admit defeat. If ships couldn't force the straits, then soldiers would clear the shores. What had begun as a naval demonstration was about to become a full-scale invasion that would consume armies. April 25, 1915. The day that would create legends and destroy empires. At V Beach, Turkish machine gunners had perfect killing fields from the cliffs above. The converted collier SS River Clyde, packed with 2,000 British troops, ran aground as planned. As soldiers poured from sally ports cut in her sides, Turkish bullets cut them down in devastating numbers. The water around the beach turned red with blood. But 14 miles north, at a cove that would forever bear their name, the ANZACS were writing their nation's birth certificates in blood. The landing plan called for a gentle advance across relatively flat ground. Instead, strong currents swept the boats north to what became Anzac Cove, a narrow beach trapped beneath towering scrub-covered cliffs. As dawn broke, Australian farmers and clerks found themselves in a vertical nightmare with Turkish rifles firing down from commanding positions. There was nowhere to go but up. And commanding the key sector of Turkish defense was a 34-year-old lieutenant colonel named Mustafa Kemal. He would later become Ataturk, father of modern Turkey. But that morning, he was an officer who understood that empires lived or died in critical moments. When Kemal spotted Australian troops climbing toward his positions, he didn't wait for orders. He famously told his 57th Regiment, "I am not ordering you to fight. I am ordering you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other forces and commanders can come and take our place." It was a death sentence, delivered with cold military logic. The regiment charged downhill and was virtually annihilated, but they bought precious time for reinforcements to arrive. Kemal himself was hit by shrapnel that shattered his pocket watch, probably saving his life. He carried that broken timepiece for the rest of his days, a reminder of the morning he helped save the Ottoman Empire. What followed was 8 months of trench warfare as brutal as anything on the Western Front, but fought in Mediterranean heat. Anzac Cove became a death trap barely 500 yards deep and 1,000 yards wide. Turkish and Allied trenches were so close that soldiers could throw grenades into enemy positions. Men fought among swarms of flies, endemic dysentery, and the constant stench of decomposing corpses that couldn't be buried in the narrow confines. Disease was killing more men than enemy bullets. The August offensive at Suvla Bay promised breakthrough, but delivered only more slaughter. British troops came ashore virtually unopposed, but hesitated, following cautious procedures instead of exploiting their advantage. By the time they advanced, Turkish reinforcements had seized the crucial high ground. By autumn, Gallipoli had become another bloody stalemate, consuming resources and lives with nothing to show for it. Churchill had already been forced to resign. The man who had promised to shorten the war had delivered 8 months of costly failure. The evacuation in December, became a tactical masterpiece that demonstrated what the entire campaign could have been with proper planning. Over 19 nights, 83,000 troops disappeared without losing a single life to enemy action. Dummy soldiers constructed from sandbags manned trenches. Rifles rigged with dripping water cans fired automatically to simulate continued occupation. Even Mustafa Kemal later admitted his admiration for the operation. It was the only part of the entire campaign that could be called unqualified success. The final accounting was devastating. Approximately 250,000 Allied casualties and similar Ottoman losses. Over 500,000 human beings had been killed, wounded, or driven permanently insane for no strategic gain whatsoever. While Churchill was drowning British prestige in Turkish blood, something far more sinister was happening in Belgium. April 22, 1915, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Near the town of Ypres, German soldiers opened valves on 5,000 steel cylinders. A yellow-green cloud began drifting across no man's land on the spring breeze. Fritz Haber had convinced German high command that chemical weapons could break the deadlock of trench warfare. The faster we can terrorize the enemy, he argued, the sooner this war will end. French colonial troops holding the line north of Ypres saw the strange cloud approaching and assumed it was a smokescreen. Then the wind shifted, and the gas settled into their trenches like fog from a nightmare. Chlorine attacks the respiratory system with chemical precision, reacting with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. Men began choking, gasping, clawing at their throats as their lungs filled with bloody foam. Those who couldn't run fast enough drowned in their own fluids while standing upright. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Thousands of troops abandoned their positions in panic. A 4-mile gap opened in the Allied line. German infantry, wearing primitive gas masks, advanced through the yellow cloud toward objectives they had only dreamed of reaching. But the Germans weren't prepared for their own success. They had brought insufficient reserves to exploit the breakthrough. Many of their own troops were terrified of advancing through lingering gas clouds. By evening, Canadian forces had rushed to fill the gap, and the opportunity was lost. The Second Battle of Ypres had introduced industrial-scale chemical warfare, but it would take months to perfect the technique. Within weeks, both sides were manufacturing proper gas masks and developing new chemical weapons. The arms race had entered a new dimension of horror. What had begun as an experiment in terror was becoming standard military practice, but poison gas was only one front in Germany's expanding war on civilization. Beneath the waves, German U-boats were about to cross a line that would shock the world and ultimately drag America into the conflict. May 7, 1915. 11 miles off the coast of Ireland, the RMS Lusitania was completing her 101st Atlantic crossing. The fastest passenger liner in the world, she carried 1,962 passengers and crew from New York to Liverpool. Among them were wealthy Americans, British businessmen, families with children, and infants in their mothers' arms. Captain William Turner had received warnings about U-boat activity in Irish waters. The German embassy had even published advertisements in American newspapers warning passengers not to travel on British ships. But the Lusitania was fast, faster than any submarine, and her passengers felt secure in British naval supremacy. U-20, commanded by Captain Walter Schwieger, had been patrolling Irish waters for 6 days. His orders were clear: sink any enemy vessel without warning. The distinction between warship and passenger liner was a luxury Germany could no longer afford. At 2:10 in the afternoon, Schwieger spotted the massive liner through his periscope. He fired a single torpedo from 700 meters. The torpedo struck the starboard side just below the bridge. The explosion was followed immediately by a second, much larger blast. The Lusitania began listing severely, making it impossible to launch most lifeboats. 18 minutes. That's how long it took for the pride of the Cunard line to disappear beneath the waves. Passengers who had been enjoying lunch found themselves fighting for their lives in the frigid Atlantic. Mothers held their babies above water until their strength failed. When rescue ships arrived, they pulled 764 survivors from the water. 1,198 souls had perished, including 128 Americans. The reaction in America was explosive. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Mass murder on the high seas." Editorial cartoons showed German submarines attacking baby carriages. Former President Theodore Roosevelt called it piracy on a scale of murder. Recruiting stations saw long lines of angry young Americans demanding to enlist, though America wasn't yet at war. But President Woodrow Wilson faced an impossible choice. Public opinion demanded action, but America was unprepared for war. The U.S. Army numbered just 98,000 men, smaller than many European divisions. Wilson chose diplomacy over war, sending increasingly stern notes to Berlin demanding Germany abandon unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany, shocked by the international reaction, temporarily restricted submarine attacks on passenger ships. But the precedent had been set. Modern warfare was erasing the distinction between combatant and civilian, between military target and innocent victim. The chlorine clouds of Ypres and the torpedo that sank the Lusitania marked a turning point in human warfare. Science, industry, and military strategy had combined to create new forms of mass killing. The rules of civilized warfare were dying along with everything else, but 1915 wasn't finished with its lessons in industrial slaughter. On the Eastern Front, Russia was bleeding to death on two fronts while discovering that numerical superiority meant nothing against modern weapons and competent leadership. Since the war began, Russia had suffered nearly 4 million casualties. Entire armies had simply vanished into the forests of East Prussia and the mud of Galicia. Through 1915, German and Austro-Hungarian forces drove Russian armies back hundreds of miles. Warsaw fell. Poland was lost. Russian troops retreated so far they abandoned territory the size of France. The retreat became a human catastrophe as millions of civilians fled ahead of advancing armies, clogging roads with ox carts and desperate families. Russian soldiers, demoralized and undersupplied, began deserting in growing numbers. Equipment shortages reached critical proportions. New Russian recruits often waited for rifles until veteran soldiers fell in battle. Artillery shells were so scarce that some batteries fired just a handful per day against German forces firing thousands per hour. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II made the decision that would seal his dynasty's doom. In August 1915, with Russian armies in full retreat, Nicholas dismissed Grand Duke Nicholas as commander-in-chief and took personal command of the army. It seemed like strong leadership. The Tsar himself would rally Russian forces and drive back the invaders. Instead, it was political suicide. By taking command, Nicholas tied his personal prestige directly to military performance. Every defeat became his defeat. Every retreat became his retreat. Every casualty list bore his personal responsibility. The Tsar had made himself the scapegoat for Russia's military disasters. Worse, his decision left the capital in the hands of his wife Alexandra and her advisor, the mystic Grigory Rasputin. Alexandra was German-born and deeply unpopular. Rasputin was a drunken peasant who claimed mystical powers. Together, they became symbols of everything wrong with the Russian monarchy. While Nicholas played soldier at army headquarters, breadlines formed in Petrograd. While he issued optimistic bulletins about future victories, workers went on strike in armaments factories. While he maintained the facade of imperial authority, his empire was collapsing beneath him. By late 1915, cracks in Russian society were becoming impossible to hide. The army that had begun the war as the Russian steamroller had become a broken machine, consuming men faster than the empire could replace them. Revolution was brewing in the factories and breadlines of Russia's cities. though the Tsar remained oblivious to the growing crisis. As 1915 ended, over 5 million men were dead or missing. Poison gas had become routine. Submarine warfare threatened to expand the conflict across every ocean. The Old World's last illusions about civilized warfare had drowned with the Lusitania and died in the gas clouds of Ypres. War was no longer between armies. It was between entire populations, entire civilizations, entire ways of life. And 1916 would prove that when it came to industrial slaughter, humanity had only just begun to explore the depths of its own capacity for destruction. The year ahead would bring battles so vast and costly, they would dwarf everything that had come before. At Verdun, the Germans would attempt to bleed France white in the most calculated mass murder scheme in military history. On the Somme, the British would sacrifice an entire generation in a single day. At sea, the greatest naval battle in history would prove that even dreadnought battleships were no match for the mathematics of modern firepower. But perhaps most ominously, cracks were beginning to show in the facades of the great empires. In Russia, revolution was stirring. In Germany, the naval blockade was slowly strangling the civilian population. In Austria-Hungary, competing nationalisms were pulling the empire apart from within. The old world was dying in the trenches, and what would replace it remained terrifyingly unclear. February 21st, 1916, 4:15 in the morning. What happened next was so loud it shattered windows in villages 50 miles away and drove farm animals insane with terror. The opening barrage at Verdun fired roughly 1 million shells in the first day alone. 1 shell for every 2 people living in the city. The sound carried for miles across eastern France. Trees weren't just cut down. They were atomized into sawdust. Hills disappeared. Human beings were vaporized so completely that families never found enough remains to bury. But here's the twisted genius of General Erich von Falkenhayn's plan. He didn't want to capture Verdun. He wanted to use it as bait in the most calculating mass murder scheme in military history. Falkenhayn had done the math with cold precision. Germany couldn't win through breakthrough. The Western Front was too strong. But Germany could win by turning warfare into an accounting problem. Find a place France would defend at any cost, then make that cost higher than France could afford to pay. Verdun was perfect psychological warfare. The fortress city was ancient, symbolic, sacred to French national pride. More importantly, it stuck out into German lines like a thumb begging to be chopped off. Falkenhayn could attack from 3 sides, while France could only supply it through one road under constant German observation, bleeding France white. Falkenhayn's strategy wasn't a battle plan. It was a business model. Germany would use superior firepower and logistics to create a human meat grinder that consumed French divisions faster than they could be replaced. The bombardment worked beyond German nightmares. French positions didn't just get destroyed, they were erased from existence. Communication lines vaporized. Officers lost contact with their men and assumed everyone was dead. Some French units were buried alive and had to dig themselves out of their own graves. But small groups of French soldiers survived in impossible places: cellars, tunnels, shell holes filled with corpses. When German infantry advanced expecting to find empty trenches, machine gun fire erupted from positions that should have been obliterated. What should have been a victory parade became a 10-month descent into hell. General Philippe Pétain arrived to take command on February 25th and immediately realized he was managing an apocalypse. Verdun was connected to France by the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way, a single road that had to carry everything: ammunition, food, reinforcements, hope itself. Here's the insane part. Pétain organized a conveyor belt of human misery that actually worked. Truck convoys ran day and night along the sacred way, bringing fresh troops forward and hauling broken men back. No French division stayed at Verdun long enough to be completely destroyed. They rotated in for weeks of hell, then rotated out for psychological recovery. It was like feeding logs into a furnace. Each unit burned, but the fire never went out. By battle's end, most French divisions had rotated through Verdun. Almost every French family would receive a letter from hell. The Germans called it the Blutmühle, the blood mill. French soldiers called it l'enfer, hell. Both names were understatements. Fort Douaumont, supposedly impregnable, fell to German assault troops in February because most of its garrison had been pulled out for service elsewhere. 10 German soldiers captured the strongest fortress in Europe by walking through an unlocked door. Sometimes, the most sophisticated defenses fail for the most ridiculous reasons, but losing Douaumont only made French determination more insane. General Robert Nivelle issued the order that would define French national character. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. It wasn't just military strategy. It was a suicide pact with national honor. What followed defied human description. Men lived in shell holes filled with decomposing bodies and rats the size of cats. They drank water contaminated with human remains. They ate food crawling with maggots because maggots meant the food was still technically organic matter. Private Paul Truffaut wrote to his wife, "Humanity is mad. It must be mad to do what it is doing. What a massacre. What scenes of horror and carnage. Hell cannot be so terrible." No, a German shell killed him 2 days later, probably while he was eating his morning ration of maggoty bread. Here's a detail that sounds fictional, but isn't. Soldiers developed a condition called burial shock from being buried alive repeatedly by collapsing trenches. Men would dig themselves out of one collapse only to be buried by the next shell. Some spent entire days underground, clawing through dirt and corpses to reach air. The weather joined the assault on human sanity. Winter rain turned shell holes into ice-rimmed pools where wounded men drowned before they could be rescued. Spring mud was so deep that stretcher bearers sometimes disappeared completely, swallowed by earth along with the wounded they were trying to save. Summer heat made the stench of decomposing bodies so intense that men vomited from smell alone. Moore Home, Dead Man's Hill, changed hands 16 times. Each attack left more bodies on its slopes until the hill was literally built from human remains. The village of Fleury was captured and recaptured 17 times. By battle's end, aerial photographs showed nothing but crater marks where a community had once existed. The psychological toll created its own horror stories. Soldiers developed the 1,000-yard stare, empty eyes that had seen too much death to process. Some went catatonic, standing motionless in trenches until shells killed them. Others developed hysterical mutism. They could no longer speak, could only point and grunt and weep. Medical facilities became scenes from Dante's nightmares. Doctors amputated limbs by candlelight in underground bunkers while shells exploded overhead. When anesthetics ran out, surgeons held men down and sawed off shattered limbs while patients screamed. Hospital trains arrived in Paris, carrying men who had aged 20 years in 20 days. By summer, Falkenhayn's accounting was working exactly as planned. France was hemorrhaging entire generations into the Verdun meat grinder. German casualties were heavy, but French losses were mathematically unsustainable. The French army was being bled white division by division, exactly as predicted. Then something beautiful and terrible happened. Britain launched the Battle of the Somme. Suddenly, Germany faced pressure on two fronts. Falkenhayn had to choose between continuing his war of attrition at Verdun or defending against British attacks elsewhere. The master of calculating slaughter couldn't calculate his way out of fighting two battles simultaneously. But before we dive into Britain's catastrophic contribution to 1916's slaughter, we need to understand what was happening to the men actually fighting these battles. The human cost wasn't just measured in casualties. It was measured in the complete transformation of what it meant to be human in the 20th century. The soldiers who survived Verdun weren't the same species that had marched to war in 1914. They had become something new, men who could function in conditions that should have destroyed body and soul. They developed new reflexes, new instincts, new ways of staying alive when civilization itself had collapsed around them. They learned to sleep standing up because lying down might mean drowning in mud. They learned to eat while corpses decomposed inches away because hunger was stronger than revulsion. They learned to distinguish between the sounds of different shells by their whistling, which ones to ignore, which ones meant death was coming specifically for you. Most importantly, they learned that courage wasn't about being brave. Courage was about continuing to function when your mind had shut down to protect itself from processing the impossible. It was about performing your duties when every rational thought screamed that you should run, hide, or simply curl up in a ball and wait for death. The French developed a term for this transformation, cafard, literally meaning cockroach, but describing the mental state of men who had survived so long in hell that they had become something other than human. Not better, not worse, just fundamentally different from the civilians they had once been. Veterans would return home after the war and discover they couldn't relate to people who worried about normal problems. How do you explain to someone complaining about their job that you once spent 3 days buried alive with your dead friends? How do you care about everyday inconveniences when you've seen men torn apart by steel fragments and lived to tell about it? The war was creating a generation of men who would never fully return to peacetime society. They would carry the trenches inside them forever, not just as memories, but as permanent changes to how their minds and bodies functioned. Shell shock wasn't just a temporary condition. It was evidence of evolution in real time. Humanity adapting to survive in conditions no previous generation had ever faced. But while individual soldiers were being transformed by their experiences, the larger strategic picture was becoming increasingly clear. The war had settled into a pattern that would define the remainder of 1916 and beyond. Each side possessed enough firepower to destroy the other, but neither could achieve decisive victory through conventional means. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Modern weapons had made frontal assault suicidal, but defensive warfare couldn't win wars. It could only prevent losing them. The result was a strategic stalemate that could only be broken through attrition, and attrition meant feeding entire generations into the machinery of industrial death. This was the reality facing British commanders as they planned their contribution to 1916's slaughter. They had watched the Germans and French destroy each other at Verdun, and concluded that Britain needed to do something equally massive to relieve pressure on their allies. What they came up with was the most catastrophically stupid plan in military history. July 1st, 1916, 7:30 in the morning. What happened next was so catastrophically stupid that if you saw it in a movie, you'd say the director was exaggerating for dramatic effect. 60,000 British soldiers became casualties in a single day. 20,000 died. Most were killed in the first hour. Some units suffered 90% casualties before breakfast. It was the worst day in British military history, and it had been planned as the day that would end the war. General Douglas Haig had convinced himself that artillery could solve any military problem. For 7 days and nights, British guns had pounded German trenches with over 1.5 million shells. The bombardment could be heard across the Channel in southern England. Officers told their men they'd face little resistance. The Germans would be shell-shocked, demoralized, or dead. They were catastrophically, criminally wrong. Here's what the British didn't know. German trenches weren't just ditches in the ground. They were underground cities with concrete bunkers 40 feet deep, steel-reinforced positions, and tunnels connecting multiple defensive lines. When British shells fell, German soldiers went underground and played cards while waiting for the bombardment to end. Worse, much of the British ammunition was defective. Shells produced in hastily built factories by inexperienced workers often failed to explode. Others were filled with shrapnel designed to kill men in the open, not destroy concrete bunkers. The week-long bombardment had been an expensive fireworks display that achieved almost nothing. As British soldiers climbed from their trenches that morning, German machine gunners emerged from their bunkers, rubbed their eyes, and couldn't believe what they were seeing. Instead of the scattered rushing attacks they'd trained to repel, British troops were advancing in neat lines at walking pace across open ground. It was like a shooting gallery with human targets. The British attack plan was based on assumptions so wrong, they bordered on fantasy. Officers believed their artillery had cleared the way, so infantry was ordered to advance at walking pace to maintain formation. Soldiers carried 60-pound packs because they were expected to occupy German trenches immediately after arrival. Some units were specifically told to walk, not run, because running would indicate lack of confidence in the artillery preparation. It was military planning designed by people who had never seen a machine gun in action. The 34th Division attacked at La Boisselle and walked 800 yards across no man's land toward German positions that had survived the bombardment completely intact. Machine gun fire cut them down in waves, not metaphorical waves, but actual visible lines of men falling simultaneously as bullets swept across their formation. But the real tragedy lay in the units being destroyed, PALS battalions. These weren't professional soldiers. They were volunteers recruited from specific towns under the promise they could serve alongside their friends, neighbors, and co-workers. The Bradford Pals, the Sheffield City Battalion, the Grimsby Chums, entire communities had enlisted together. It had seemed humanitarian in 1914. It became genocide in 1916. The Accrington Pals attacked German positions at Serre and were destroyed in 20 minutes. 735 men became casualties before most had finished their morning prayers. The small Lancashire town lost an entire generation faster than a church service. Streets that had celebrated mass enlistment in 1914 received mass death telegrams in 1916. Here's a detail that captures the horror. In some northern English towns, postmen stopped delivering telegrams and just posted casualty lists on the town hall door. Families would gather each morning to see if their sons, husbands, and fathers had died the previous day. Children learned to read by spelling out the names of dead neighbors. The Ulster Division attacked at Thiepval with Protestant volunteers from Belfast, who had spent more time fighting Irish Catholics than training for war. They advanced toward German wire that artillery had failed to cut, knowing they would die but hoping their sacrifice would matter. Some units actually reached German trenches through sheer courage before being killed or driven back. By evening, Belfast newspapers were printing pages of death notices like a telephone directory of grief. Entire communities were being demographically destroyed in a single morning. Factories in northern towns struggled to operate as casualty lists emptied entire streets of workers. Britain was discovering that modern war could kill not just soldiers, but the social fabric that had created them. By noon, it was obvious that the first day had become a disaster of historic proportions. But Haig refused to admit failure. He ordered renewed attacks for the following days, then weeks, then months. What had begun as a single day's breakthrough attempt became a grinding campaign that consumed armies. In September, the British introduced a weapon that looked like science fiction, the tank. At Flers-Courcelette, the British committed 49 Mark-I tanks powered by clattering Daimler petrol engines and armed with naval guns. Only about 2/3 even reached the start line, and just a handful achieved their objectives, but they were immune to machine gun fire and could cross trenches that stopped infantry. German soldiers seeing these mechanical monsters for the first time fled in terror. A British observer reported, "A tank is walking up the high street of Flers, with the British Army cheering behind." For a brief moment, it seemed like technology might solve the problem that had consumed 1 million lives. But the tanks were too few, too unreliable, and too early. They moved at walking pace, broke down constantly, and filled with carbon monoxide that poisoned their crews. Most got stuck in shell holes, broke down mechanically, or were knocked out by German artillery. Tanks were clearly the future, but that future was still years away. The Battle of the Somme dragged on through autumn rain and mud that turned the battlefield into a brown hell. October attacks gained hundreds of yards at the cost of thousands of lives. November assaults captured villages that had been reduced to colored marks on maps. By winter, British forces had advanced 6 miles at maximum depth, territory you could walk across in 2 hours. The final accounting defied human comprehension. British casualties, 420,000. French losses, about 200,000. German casualties, estimated between 450,000 and 600,000. Over 1 million men had become casualties for territorial gains, measured in single-digit miles. But here's the most disturbing part. General Haig declared the Somme a victory. German forces had been weakened. Allied coordination had improved. Lessons had been learned that would lead to future success. He was technically correct and morally monstrous. The Battle of the Somme had achieved something beyond its territorial objectives. It had proven British forces could sustain major offensive operations. It had relieved pressure on French forces at Verdun. Most importantly, it had shown that German armies could be hurt, worn down, and forced to give ground. But in British towns where entire streets displayed mourning wreaths, strategic explanations offered no comfort. The volunteer army that had marched to war singing patriotic songs had been fed into an industrial killing machine and emerged as professional soldiers who understood the true price of modern warfare. The first day of the Somme entered British memory as the day innocents died. The PALS battalions, the idea that communities could go to war together and come home together, had been revealed as a beautiful, lethal delusion. What remained was a harder, darker understanding of what victory required in an industrial age. Britain had learned that modern war wasn't about courage, tactics, or even technology. It was about mathematics. Who could afford to lose more men, more resources, more of their national soul before the other side collapsed? And the British, it turned out, were very good at mathematics. While British mathematicians were calculating casualty rates on the Western Front, something far more dramatic was unfolding beneath the waves. The question that had haunted naval strategists for decades was about to be answered in fire and steel. Did Britain still rule the waves? May 31st, 1916. The North Sea became a testing ground for the most concentrated naval firepower in human history. 250 warships, carrying enough destructive power to level entire cities, were about to discover whether decades of theory matched the reality of steel against steel. Admiral Sir John Jellicoe commanded 28 battleships and 9 battlecruisers, the largest concentration of naval firepower ever assembled. Admiral Reinhard Scheer led 16 battleships and 5 battlecruisers, outnumbered, but hoping German engineering could overcome British numbers. For 2 years, both fleets had avoided decisive action. Now they would discover something terrifying about modern naval warfare. It killed ships faster than anyone had imagined. The Battle of Jutland began with a catastrophe that redefined naval architecture forever. HMS Indefatigable, struck by German shells, exploded in a pillar of fire visible 20 miles away. 1,100 men vaporized instantly. Not killed, not drowned, but atomized by the explosion of their own ammunition. Minutes later, HMS Queen Mary suffered the same fate. Another 1,000 sailors deleted from existence in a flash of light and heat. Admiral David Beatty, watching his magnificent ships disappear, made the understatement of the war. "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." There was indeed something wrong. British battlecruisers had sacrificed armor for speed and firepower. They looked magnificent, but couldn't survive direct hits from modern guns. When the main fleets engaged, the violence transcended human experience. 15-inch guns hurled shells weighing as much as automobiles across miles of ocean at speeds that made them invisible. Direct hits could penetrate 3 feet of steel armor and detonate inside ships like volcanic eruptions. The noise was so intense that sailors' eardrums burst from concussion alone. But the decisive phases came in a series of brief, violent engagements, punctuated by Admiral Scheer's brilliant battle turn-away maneuvers that extracted the German fleet from certain destruction. German ships disappeared into North Sea mist, leaving the British in possession of empty water and Pyrrhic victory. Both sides claimed victory. The British because the German fleet fled. The Germans because they had sunk more tonnage and killed more sailors. Both were right and irrelevant. The real result was strategic checkmate. The German high seas fleet never again risked major engagement, spending the rest of the war safely anchored, while Britain's blockade slowly strangled Germany. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russia was achieving its final moment of military brilliance before the empire's complete collapse. General Alexei Brusilov had learned from 2 years of catastrophic failure and developed something revolutionary, tactics that actually worked. While other Russian commanders still believed in human waves against machine guns, Brusilov had created sophisticated combined arms operations that anticipated modern warfare. Instead of week-long bombardments that warned everyone, he used brief, intense barrages followed immediately by infantry assault. Instead of predictable single-point attacks, his forces struck simultaneously, everywhere. The Brusilov offensive began June 4th with attacks along a 200-mile front that caught Austrian defenders completely off guard. The results were spectacular. Roughly 200,000 Austrian prisoners in the opening phase, and advances measuring tens of miles deep. The Austro-Hungarian army began disintegrating as Czech and Polish units surrendered en masse rather than die for an empire they despised. German forces had to be rushed from Verdun to prevent total Austrian collapse, providing crucial relief to French defenders. But Brusilov's success attracted a disastrous participant, Romania. Romania looked at Austrian weakness, Russian advances, and German forces committed elsewhere, and thought, perfect timing. No. King Ferdinand declared war on the Central Powers and invaded Transylvania in late August. It seemed like joining a winning team just before victory. Romania's participation lasted exactly 4 months, long enough to be completely destroyed. German and Bulgarian forces, commanded by August von Mackensen, invaded from the south, while German divisions transferred from France attacked from the north. Romanian armies caught between 2 professional military machines were systematically annihilated. By December, Bucharest had fallen and Romanian resistance had ceased to exist. The Romanian disaster gave Germany something precious: access to Romanian oil fields and grain supplies that had been feeding Allied populations. Resources that might have sustained the Allies now sustained the German war effort. Romania's brief participation had backfired so spectacularly that it probably extended the war by months. But while armies bled themselves white across 3 continents, revolution was brewing in the empire that had started this madness. By winter 1916, cracks in Russian society were becoming impossible to hide. Bread lines stretched for blocks in Petrograd. Workers struck in munitions factories. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers. The Tsar, who had taken personal command to save his army, had instead doomed his throne. By tying his fate to military success, Nicholas had guaranteed that military failure would mean political catastrophe. Russia had bled white on 2 fronts, and the man responsible sat in army headquarters, still believing he could win a war his empire could no longer afford to fight. As 1916 ended, over 2 million men had become casualties in that year alone, more than the entire population of many countries. Entire societies were mobilizing for total war. Civilians were beginning to starve as resources flowed to military production. The war was consuming not just armies, but entire civilizations. Germany, despite tactical successes and brilliant generalship, was slowly losing the war of industrial attrition. The British naval blockade was strangling German imports. American industrial production was tilting the resource balance irreversibly toward the Allies. Time was running out for victory through conventional methods. But 1916 had been the year when industrial warfare reached peak destructive efficiency. Modern armies could survive almost unlimited punishment while inflicting almost unlimited casualties. Technology and tactics had created perfect killing machines, but neither side could operate them decisively enough to end the war. Something was stirring beneath the surface, though. Revolution in Russia. American entry looming. New technologies that might break the deadlock. The old world was dying in trenches and battlefields across 3 continents, and 1917 would bring the year everything changed. The transformation began in the most unlikely place, the streets of Petrograd, where women demanding bread would topple the world's largest empire in exactly 8 days. It started with textile workers in the Vyborg district, hungry and desperate, walking out of their factories demanding bread. Within hours, they were joined by metal workers, then shopkeepers, then students. By evening, 200,000 people filled the streets, chanting, "Down with the Tsar." The Romanov dynasty, which had survived Napoleon, the Decembrists, and 300 years of Russian winters, had 8 days left to live. Here's the most incredible part. Tsar Nicholas II was 300 miles away, completely oblivious to his empire's death. While revolution consumed his capital, he was at army headquarters reading English novels and writing dismissively in his diary about some disorders in the capital. The most powerful Otto CD become the most clueless man-rat on earth in Russia. What broke the Tsar's regime was breathtakingly simple. His own soldiers chose the people over the palace. On March 11th, troops ordered to fire on demonstrators in Steyr. The Vold turned their rifles on their officers. Insky Regiment mutinied first Obrezhensky Guards, then the Prii, then entire garrisons. Soldiers who had been fighting Germans for 3 years decided they'd rather fight their own government. By March 12th, Petrograd was controlled by revolutionary workers and mutinous soldiers carrying the Tsar's own weapons. Nicholas finally realized his throne was disintegrating and decided to return to save his dynasty. But railway workers, now revolutionary sympathizers, had other plans. They diverted his imperial train to a siding at Pskov, like he was a common passenger on the wrong line. The Tsar of all the Russias was roaded by literally his own railroad workers. On March 15th, in a railway car at Pskov station, Nicholas II signed the document that ended 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The divine right of kings died with a pen stroke in a train compartment. The man who had believed God personally appointed him to rule Russia discovered that God's phone line had been disconnected. But here's the tragedy that would doom Russian democracy. Removing the Tsar didn't solve Russia's problems. It unleashed them all simultaneously. A provisional government formed under Alexander Kerensky, promising democracy, rights, and continued war against Germany. Simultaneously, workers and soldiers created their own councils, Soviets, demanding peace, land redistribution, and workers' control. Russia now had 2 governments claiming authority, both weak, both desperate, both doomed. Kerensky inherited a literally impossible situation. A lawyer turned politician, he genuinely believed Russia could become a democracy while fighting the most destructive war in human history. It was like trying to perform surgery while the patient was running a marathon during an earthquake. Every decision Kerensky made created new enemies. Continue the war? Soldiers deserted en masse. Make peace? The Allies threatened to abandon Russia. Redistribute land? Conservative officers plotted coups. Maintain property rights? Peasants seized estates anyway. Kerensky was trapped in a political death spiral with no army, no money, and no time. Then Germany played the most cynical card in modern diplomatic history. On April 16th, a sealed railway car crossed from Germany into Russia, carrying the most dangerous man on earth, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. German High Command had calculated that Lenin would destabilize Russia more effectively than any military campaign. They were so catastrophically correct that they created their own eventual destroyer. Lenin arrived at Finland Station like a political asteroid impact. While other revolutionaries debated constitutional procedures and democratic transitions, Lenin offered solutions so simple they sounded insane. Peace, land, bread. End the war immediately. Redistribute all land to peasants. Transfer all power to workers' councils. It was radical, impossible, and exactly what exhausted Russians wanted to hear. But here's what makes Lenin's success even more incredible. His party numbered barely 25,000 members in a country of 170 million. Most Russians had never heard his name. Even within his own party, many Bolsheviks initially resisted his extreme ideas. The man who would reshape world history started as a political nobody with a revolutionary plan. Then Kerensky made the decision that murdered Russian democracy. He launched one final military offensive. The July Kerensky Offensive was designed to restore Russian military credibility and democratic legitimacy. Instead, it destroyed both. Russian troops, already demoralized, suffered another 250,000 casualties for no strategic gain whatsoever. Soldiers blamed the democratic government for continuing a war they no longer understood, supported, or could win. Military discipline didn't just collapse, it reversed itself. Entire divisions elected their own officers. Soldiers shot commanders who ordered attacks. Military units simply walked away from the front, taking their weapons home to start local revolutions. Russia still had millions of men under arms, but they were no longer an army. They were an armed mob heading in every direction except toward the Germans. Lenin seized this moment with surgical precision. While Kerensky's government debated democratic procedures and legal niceties, the Bolsheviks planned a coup with revolutionary efficiency. On October 25th, Bolshevik forces occupied key points in Petrograd with a shopping list of targets: telegraph offices, railway stations, all government buildings, the central bank. The October Revolution was remarkably bloodless in Petrograd. The Winter Palace, symbol of imperial power, was defended by a women's battalion, some military cadets, and a few dozen Cossacks. After minimal fighting that produced only a handful of casualties, the Bolsheviks arrested the provisional government. World history changed hands with less violence than a typical urban riot. Kerensky escaped, disguised as a servant in a car borrowed from the American embassy. The man who had tried to democratize Russia fled his own capital like a fugitive. Democracy in Russia had lasted 8 months, shorter than most pregnancies, and significantly less successful. Lenin immediately announced Russia's withdrawal from the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 surrendered vast territories: Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, but gained something more valuable: the end of a war that was destroying Russian society faster than German armies ever could. The treaty was brilliant short-term strategy and catastrophic long-term planning for Germany. Yes, Germany could transfer millions of troops from east to west, but they also had to occupy vast new territories with troops they needed elsewhere. And they had created an ideological enemy far more dangerous than the Tsar had ever been. Lenin's revolution created something unprecedented: the world's first communist state committed to global revolution. The Bolsheviks didn't just want to rule Russia. They wanted to export revolution to every country on earth. They declared war on capitalism, democracy, and the entire existing world order. Germany's sealed train had delivered a virus that would consume the 20th century. Lenin's revolution would inspire communist movements from China to Cuba, create the Soviet Union, divide the world into competing ideological camps for 70 years, and ultimately outlast the German Empire that had created it. The most successful covert operation in history was also the most self-destructive. Germany had knocked Russia out of the war, but created an enemy that would eventually march into Berlin itself. But while Lenin was consolidating power in Russia, Germany was making another catastrophic diplomatic error that would drag America into the war and seal the fate of the Central Powers forever. January 19, 1917. In a nondescript office building in London, British cryptographers decoded a telegram so explosive they initially thought it might be German disinformation designed to discredit Germany. It wasn't. It was German stupidity so profound it defied rational explanation. The Zimmermann telegram was diplomatic suicide disguised as diplomatic strategy. German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann had sent his ambassador in Mexico a proposal so insanely provocative it seemed designed to drag America into the war. If America entered the conflict, Mexico should attack the United States and reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Germany would provide financial support and military assistance. The telegram also suggested Mexico should persuade Japan to join the anti-American alliance. Here's what makes this even more incredible. Mexico was in no position to accept such a proposal, even if they'd wanted to. The Mexican government was broke, barely controlled half their own country, and was fighting a brutal civil war. Asking Mexico to invade the United States was like asking a man with a broken leg to run a marathon against an Olympic sprinter. British intelligence sat on the telegram for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate this diplomatic nuclear bomb. That moment came in March when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and President Wilson was still desperately trying to maintain American neutrality. The British handed the Zimmermann telegram to American officials like a loaded gun pointed at Germany's head. When American newspapers published the telegram on March 1st, the reaction was volcanic. Headlines screamed, "Germany seeks alliance against us." Editorial cartoons showed German eagles and Mexican vultures circling Texas. Anti-German riots erupted across the country. Americans who had been indifferent to European warfare suddenly saw German submarines lurking off their coasts and German agents plotting to steal their southwestern states. Then Zimmermann did something so diplomatically naive it bordered on political suicide. He publicly admitted sending the telegram. When reporters asked if it was genuine, the German Foreign Secretary said yes. He had sent it and saw nothing wrong with seeking alliances against potential enemies. Zimmermann thought honesty was better than denial, but his honesty was so perfectly timed to destroy German-American relations that it seemed like sabotage. President Woodrow Wilson faced the decision that would transform America from an isolated republic into a global superpower. For 3 years, he had kept America neutral through moral conviction and political calculation. "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight," he had said after the Lusitania sinking. Now that pride was being tested by German submarines, German plots, and German arrogance. Wilson was a former professor who genuinely believed in international law, moral diplomacy, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. But he was also a politician who understood that American public opinion had shifted decisively against Germany. The Zimmermann telegram had accomplished what 3 years of German atrocities couldn't. It had made Americans believe Germany threatened them personally, geographically, and immediately. Meanwhile, Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st, the policy suspended after the Lusitania crisis. German naval commanders calculated they could starve Britain into submission before America could mobilize effectively. It was another German gamble based on mathematical arrogance and strategic blindness that ignored American industrial capacity. U-boats immediately began sinking American merchant ships with methodical efficiency. The steamer Housatonic was torpedoed on February 3rd. The tanker Illinois was sunk on March 18th. American sailors were dying in the Atlantic, killed by German torpedoes fired without warning against neutral vessels flying the American flag. Each sinking pushed America closer to inevitable war. On April 2nd, Wilson appeared before Congress to request a declaration of war with words that would echo through the 20th century. The world must be made safe for democracy. Wilson wasn't just asking Congress to fight Germany. He was asking America to remake the international order itself. But here's what most Americans didn't realize. Their country was spectacularly, almost comically unprepared for European warfare. The U.S. Army numbered 133,000 men, smaller than some European divisions, and roughly equivalent to the police force of a large city. American factories were producing automobiles and consumer goods, not artillery shells and machine guns. The country had no experience mobilizing millions of men for overseas deployment against professional European armies. America was entering a war that had already consumed 10 million lives with military forces that could barely defend the East Coast. Congress passed the Selective Service Act in May, requiring all men between 21 and 30 to register for military service. The first lottery was held on July 20th, with Secretary of War Newton Baker blindfolded, drawing number 258 from a glass bowl. American democracy was selecting its warriors through a lottery system that looked more like a game show than military planning. Training camps sprouted across America like military mushrooms. Camp Devens in Massachusetts, Camp Gordon in Georgia, Camp Lewis in Washington. Millions of young men who had never left their home counties were learning to march, shoot, and follow orders from professional soldiers who had never commanded more than a few hundred troops in peacetime. The first American Expeditionary Force troops arrived in France in June 1917, led by General John J. Pershing. When Pershing visited Lafayette's tomb in Paris, he made the symbolic declaration, "Lafayette, we are here." It was a moment of poetic justice that masked practical problems. American troops were enthusiastic but inexperienced, well-equipped but untested, numerous but completely unprepared for the industrial slaughter they were entering. Most American forces wouldn't engage in major combat until mid-1918, which gave them crucial time to learn European warfare without facing its full horror immediately. Meanwhile, German U-boat warfare was achieving exactly what German admirals had predicted. Britain was starving. April 1917 became the worst month for Allied shipping losses in the entire war. 860,000 tons of vessels sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. Britain was importing enough food to feed its population for only 6 weeks. German submarines were winning the war one merchant ship at a time, and victory seemed mathematically inevitable. Then the Allies stumbled onto a solution so obvious it seemed revolutionary: convoys. Instead of sending merchant ships individually across the Atlantic like scattered targets, they grouped them together under naval escort. U-boats that attacked convoys faced destroyers, depth charges, and coordinated anti-submarine warfare instead of defenseless cargo vessels. Shipping losses plummeted while American troops and supplies crossed the Atlantic in ever-increasing numbers. General Pershing refused Allied demands to integrate American troops into British and French units as replacement fodder. "The United States will put its troops on the firing line when it shall have formed an army worthy of the American people," he declared. It was militarily sound and politically essential. America would fight as America, not as European cannon fodder. By autumn 1917, American soldiers were arriving in Europe at a rate of 50,000 per month, an entire division, every few weeks. These doughboys brought something the war had consumed: fresh manpower, unlimited industrial capacity, and naive optimism about achieving decisive victory. The Zimmermann telegram had accomplished something no German military victory could have achieved. It had transformed American isolationism into American interventionism. Germany's attempt to keep America neutral had instead mobilized American public opinion for total war. The telegram had awakened the sleeping giant that would dominate the 20th century. America was no longer an isolated republic, protected by two oceans. It was becoming the arsenal of democracy and the future global superpower. Germany's fatal diplomatic error had created the enemy that would ultimately defeat it. But while America was mobilizing its industrial might, Britain was about to launch what its commander promised would be the final offensive of the war. Instead, General Douglas Haig was about to create a brown hell where hope went to drown. July 31st, 1917. Belgium, Passchendaele. The Third Battle of Ypres began with the largest artillery bombardment in British history. 4.5 million shells fired in 10 days. The barrage was so intense it could be heard in London across the English Channel. Haig believed this time would be different, because this time artillery would obliterate German defenses completely. He was wrong in ways that redefined human suffering. Here's what he didn't understand about Belgian geography. The Ypres salient was the worst possible place for artillery bombardment. Belgian farmland sat just below sea level, kept dry by centuries of careful drainage engineering. 4.5 million shells didn't just destroy German trenches. They shattered the entire water management system that had kept this land habitable since medieval times. Then nature joined the assault on human sanity. August 1917 brought the wettest summer in Belgian memory. Rain that fell for days, then weeks, turning the battlefield into a brown liquid nightmare. Shell holes filled with water and became death traps. Wounded soldiers drowned in puddles too small to bathe a child. Stretcher bearers disappeared completely, swallowed by mud that had the consistency of cement and the smell of death. Canadian Corps Commander Arthur Currie walked the battlefield before the attack and delivered a prediction of mathematical precision to Haig. The offensive would cost 16,000 Canadian casualties for 4,000 yards of worthless mud. His estimate was exactly accurate. Haig ordered the attack anyway, convinced that German morale was about to collapse and one more push would end the war. What followed was 3 months of suffering that pushed human endurance beyond previously known limits. Men lived in shell holes filled with water and decomposing bodies. They slept standing up because lying down meant drowning. Some soldiers were buried alive so many times by collapsing trenches that they developed claustrophobia so severe they screamed when entering any enclosed space, including their own homes after the war. The mud at Passchendaele wasn't just mud. It was a mixture of Belgian clay, human blood, chemical explosives, and organic matter that created a substance unlike anything in nature. It had the consistency of thick porridge, the color of dried blood, and a smell that combined decomposition with industrial chemicals. Men who fell into deep mud couldn't climb out without help. Some simply gave up and drowned, rather than struggle against the impossible weight. Medical evacuation became a nightmare within a nightmare. Wounded soldiers couldn't be carried on stretchers through the mud because stretcher bearers would sink and become trapped. Instead, the wounded were dragged on waterproof sheets or carried piggyback by men who often collapsed from exhaustion and joined the wounded they were trying to save. Many wounded died not from their injuries, but from drowning during evacuation attempts that took hours to cover distances measurable in yards. The psychological casualties created new categories of human breakdown. Shell shock reached epidemic proportions among troops who experienced months of constant artillery bombardment. Men developed uncontrollable tremors, inability to speak, or catatonic stares that lasted for days. Some began laughing uncontrollably and couldn't stop. Others became convinced they were already dead and refused to eat, drink, or acknowledge other human beings. By October, the offensive had gained exactly 4.5 miles, the distance a healthy person could walk in 90 minutes on solid ground. British Empire casualties totaled 360,000 men. German losses were estimated at 260,000. Nearly 600,000 human beings had been killed, wounded, or driven permanently insane for less than 5 miles of Belgian swamp that was strategically worthless. The village of Passchendaele, the operation's final objective, no longer existed as anything recognizable. Aerial photographs showed only brown crater marks where a community had once housed families, businesses, and a church. Canadian forces finally captured the site on November 6th. But captured was meaningless since there was nothing left to capture except mud, memories, and the ghosts of a 1,000-year-old Flemish village. But while Haig was drowning the British Empire in Belgian mud, something extraordinary was happening. In a theater most people had forgotten existed, General Edmund Allenby had been transferred from the Western Front to Palestine after his failures at Arras. What seemed like military exile to manage a colonial sideshow. Instead, Allenby was about to achieve something no Western Front general had managed since 1914. Decisive, meaningful victory. The Palestine campaign was everything the Western Front wasn't: mobile, dynamic, and capable of producing actual strategic results. Allenby combined traditional cavalry charges with modern artillery, aircraft, and intelligence that created a new form of combined arms warfare. He had crucial help from Arab irregulars, led by Prince Faisal, and advised by a diminutive British intelligence officer named T.E. Lawrence. Lawrence of Arabia was the most improbable military genius of the war, a scholarly archaeologist who spoke fluent Arabic and had convinced feuding Arab tribes to unite against Turkish rule. Lawrence led camel-mounted raiders against Turkish railway lines, creating chaos behind enemy lines through guerrilla warfare that anticipated 20th century insurgency tactics. He was part scholar, part warrior, part theatrical performer, and completely effective at destroying Turkish logistics. The capture of Aqaba in July had demonstrated Lawrence's unconventional brilliance. Arab forces had approached the Turkish fortress from the landward side, the one direction Turkish defenders considered impossible because it required crossing the desert. The garrison surrendered with minimal resistance, giving the Allies a crucial naval base that opened southern Palestine to invasion. On October 31st, Allenby launched the Third Battle of Gaza, using tactics that would have been impossible on the Western Front: mobility, surprise, and cavalry charges. British horsemen charged Turkish positions with sabers drawn like something from a Napoleonic battle. Australian light horse galloped across open desert toward enemy trenches in attacks that succeeded through speed and shock rather than attrition. Turkish forces, weakened by Arab harassment and demoralized by defeats elsewhere, began retreating northward in increasing disorder. Allenby pursued with a combination of cavalry, armored cars, and aircraft that made Turkish retreat impossible and surrender inevitable. Within weeks, British forces were approaching Jerusalem, the holy city that had been under Ottoman control since 1517. On December 9th, Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot out of respect for the city's religious significance to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. He had specifically refused to enter mounted, saying no Christian general should ride triumphantly into the holy city. The gesture was perfect public relations that presented Allenby as a liberator rather than a conqueror, and so the guns fell silent at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. 4 empires lay dead. 9 million soldiers would never come home. The world that had danced in the golden summer of 1914 was gone forever, replaced by something harder, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. The Great War had ended, but its children, fascism, communism, and the machinery of total war, would soon consume the 20th century. One gunshot in Sarajevo had indeed destroyed the old world. What rose from its ashes would prove even more terrible.